And by doing so, bring up the numbers of racers at every track, because every track feeds every other track. We're all, kind of one ecosystem, right? We're all kind of in racing together. And that was the idea behind it, and it's working. We're seeing cars come out of the woodwork that have been sitting in garages and fields forever. I think you're going to see more of those cars because they're easy. It's bolt-on. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to figure it out. You don't have to do the geometry. It's done for you. In a lot of cases, a lot of those cars are done by a factory, chassis builder who puts his whole life into figuring out the front-end geometry. That being said, the guys who are building them themselves, I don't think they're at a huge disadvantage in this class. I don't think it's the same as like a modified or a late model for that matter, where the rear suspension matters so much more because you can't really change the factory mounting points.
Well, when you're talking this division of cars, people are looking at the wrong end. It's not the rear that you're getting beat by. It's the front when you start talking metrics versus Camaros.
Well, and that's true, but honestly, we haven't seen the dominance by either one. I mean, if we did, we might be looking at some kind of a rule change. I mean,
and what I mean by that, let me qualify what I said. What I mean by that is if you look at a Camaro in the corner versus a metric Monte Carlo, the metric Monte Carlo is just corner way better.
Oh, yeah. I agree with that. But if you look at IMCA's definition, why doesn't IMCA allow Camaros if that's the case? I mean, if Camaros are going to get beat by metrics all day long.
Because Camaros are considered a sports car.
That's exactly right.
Right.
They consider them a sports car. But the fact is, there is no competitive advantage. Camaros, the street stocks do really, really good on dry slate. I mean, metrics do really, really good on dry slate. Camaros tend to be more of an out-of-the-box. They tend to work better in all situations without much change to the setup. And that's true of most of the leaf spring cars, Novas included. They just work better across the board. Metrics, you have to be more involved with the setup in order to make them work for changing track conditions, but if you get it right, it's kind of like the difference between a swing arm and a 4-bar car. Swing arms tend to be more forgiving, but also not as, awesome when things are perfect, as a 4-bar car is awesome when things are perfect. And so there's similarities there. And but I like to see the head-to-head. I like to see the people who love Camaros rooting for the Camaro to win. And we had 2 Novas, 2 Camaros, and 2 Monte Carlos win last year.
Right.
In the Iron Giant Series.
Let's talk right now, what is the best answer or the best solution for this division and where the state is for those two divisions of cars? What's the best resolution for this? In your opinion. I just want your opinion.
In my opinion, run them this year, see what kind of chatter it brings.
Well,
Jerry's got his races set up. Several of the guys who just because some of the guys have changed over and put factory firewall and floorboard in them, it doesn't preclude you from being able to run an IMCA stock car. You can run with a factory firewall and floorboard. It's not a requirement. You can run, but you don't have to run a fabricated firewall and floorboard. That being said, several of those cars that came back from back east are planning on running the IMCA races under the rules, changing the carburetor and making sure that their motor meets the rules. And I think that's great.
Okay,
they can run in both classes.
Well, the way the things are right now, what about the guys that have put the 602 crates in their car that makes them illegal for IMCA?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a question for IMCA, and I'm not sure why they went that route, but they did.
Well,
they
White House, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. So
I just got that question. I've been sitting here staring at the rules while we've been talking to you for IMCA stock cars versus the street stocks. And the 602 crate motor is a legal motor for IMCA stock cars. However,
Did you say illegal?
It is legal. You can run it in an IMCA stock car. You do not get a crate concession like you do in other classes, and you can run it with a 350 CFM carburetor for sure.
Right.
However, I don't know the block number, chassis number, or the head numbers. It is possible that it is legal for a 500 CFM carburetor.
I don't think they are.
I don't think they are because I think, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong because I haven't really looked into this too much, but I believe that the Vortec heads, which the crate motors come with, aren't one of the legal sets of heads for the 500 CFM carbs.
Well, and the other issue on that, too, is also the intake number.
Correct. The intake number.
And rods and...
So, that just kind of puts everybody in this, I don't want to say purgatory, but it's a mess right now. I think, and I agree with what you said, to get a better resolution, to get a resolution period on these two different types of race cars, let them race this year. I think that's going to spark the interest in the IMCA stock cars for those who want to be in it, okay, that are interested in that class. It's going to spark the interest and help grow it, and at the same time still provide the incredible street stock racing that we see week in and week out here in the Pacific Northwest.
I totally agree, and let's be honest. Street stock racing has a finite amount of time left, in the way we know it right now. But remember that we're racing the same cars that we were racing 30 years ago. I am literally driving a car that's been on the track for 30 years. There's not that many of them out there, and eventually they're not going to be there anymore. In fact, you're seeing aftermarket frames coming out from AVCO and some other manufacturers. Howe is making one for the metrics. At some point, we're going to have to look towards newer cars for those chassis. That's one of the cool things about the class last year is we had a newer LTD out there with the 4-link, the factory 4-link in the back of it. It's a cop car.
Mm-hmm.
My car, my Chevelle, was built into a race car 10 years after it was new. Imagine going and getting an 07 Challenger, Camaro, Mustang, and making it a street stock car right now. We're not doing that anymore. We haven't been doing that for 20 years, 30 years, not since the late 90s, or early 90s, I mean. So at some point, we're going to run out of these cars. We have to look towards the next step. And IMCA stock cars may be that next step because they can run those aftermarket frames and aftermarket bodies, and it does look different than a modified, and it does look different than a late model, and there's a whole different set of rules to it. As long as they keep it in line with what a stock, street-driven vehicle has for suspension, for the most part, then you're probably in a good place for that class. It needs to be lower than the modifieds. It needs to have more restrictions to it than a modified. But that doesn't mean that it needs to be pure stock. A lot of people have a tendency to confuse the classes, and that's partially driven by the confusion that was created in the 80s and 90s. Everybody calling it, every track had its own class of cars, and they named them whatever they wanted to name them. Everything from super stocks to pure stocks to bombers to I raced in a class called the Hales Whales. And it had to be minimum of 118-inch wheelbase. It was like Cadillacs and Olds 88s, but we were racing them like regular race cars. Anyway, the point is that the pure stocks back in the day were basically an enduro car. You had a 4-point cage, no front hoop, no rear hoop, no suspension changes, no motor changes. You weren't supposed to change the cam. The thing is, everybody did. Everybody cheated. And in every class, people cheat. And some of them, they do it on purpose, and some of them, they do it, by accident. But if you're going to have the IMCA stock cars work and work well, and I think this is true of the modifieds too, you need to have them tacked. They need to have a tech guy. And we've been trying to tech our cars. In fact, we've been teching our cars. Maybe not as consistently as we would like, but we've been teching them at least a third of the time to make sure that everybody's playing by the same set of rules. I'm of the mindset, I believe what Bill used to say was, it's hard to cheat when there's not a lot of rules. And I've raced under both a lot of rules and a little bit of rules, and I would take a little bit of rules any day of the week. It's cheaper. It's like you said about
it's
the head
true.
and the part numbers.
You there?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm there.
Go ahead.
So, it's like you were saying about the part number requirement for the IMCA stock cars for the heads. When you require a specific part number, those heads in the Northwest, as soon as that class started running here, just became worth money.
Mm-hmm.
Even yesterday, they were a $50 set of heads. Today, if somebody knows what they are and knows that people are looking for them, they're worth some money. And they'll be worth more money as people start to learn that. If many people may not remember, but we used to be required to run a cast iron intake. And Chevy made a high-rise cast iron intake they called the marine intake. And a used marine intake used to cost $300. I know because I paid it twice. I bought two of them. Same with we were required to run cast iron exhaust at one time. Well, a cast iron manifold used to cost a 3-inch brand new was $180 a side, and that's not counting the Brzezinskis that you could buy, which were even more than that. I can go buy a set of headers on eBay for $50 or Craigslist. In fact, I did it last summer. So I'm still a firm advocate that fewer rules is cheaper racing in the end. I know it seems like it's counterintuitive, but that's been my experience.
Well, a lot of that I agree with in the long run. And I think that what you say about street stocks changing as we know it, like everything, that's inevitable. I think it's a bad thing if it has to go to the level of an IMCA stock car as an entry-level class. That's going to take a lot of guys out of racing.
I agree with you, Corey. What I would like to see, and I've been kind of waiting for this to happen, I'd like to see the Camaros, Challengers, Chargers, and Mustangs from the late 90s, early 2000s start showing up. We haven't seen that yet, but it's going to happen. And they're full-frame cars, well, at least the Chargers, and I think the Camaros are too. I'm not positive. But rear-wheel drive cars, newer muscle cars. I think a lot of the reason we're losing viewership on racing, and I'm not just talking about the local grassroots level, this goes all the way up to NASCAR. There's no difference in the cars, not from the fans' point of view. When you sit in the stands and you look at 24 late models on the track, you have no idea who's driving those cars if you're not a fan every week. You don't know those people from Adam. And the only thing you know is what color the car is and what number he's got on the side. That's all you really know. Mm-hmm. And you kind of pick, well, that guy's going to win because he's red, and I like red. Whereas with the street stocks, you can say, hey, that's a Monte Carlo. I had one of those in high school. I'm going to root for that guy. Mm-hmm. When NASCAR was at its most popular, we could identify with cars. Now, it's just a sticker package. I mean, when you root for a Chevy, what are you rooting for, a block? Because that's the only part of the engine that's really Chevy, and the rest of the car is not really Chevy. And I think that's true of every class of racing. Every one. World of Outlaws to pavement, super late models, to dirt late models to modified. And I think if you wanted the four cylinders right now, the four bangers and the whatever you want to call them, the 4Bs, depending on what track you're at, I think those cars have more of a connection with fans who aren't weekly racers than any other class. In fact, I think the street stocks are kind of losing. Sorry about that. are losing some of their shine with drivers